Kant realizes that there is a problem, however, with his theory of the good will. The problem is almost obvious, and that is that everyone, regardless of what they want to do or what they actually do, they think that it is good. Even the worst, most monstrous people in all of history, genocidal monsters like Genghis Khan and Mao Zedong and the ever-faithful Hitler, thought that what they were doing was good. It was the right thing to do. Now, obviously, this is problematic. I mean, if what everyone thinks is good, then we have all sorts of contradictions. So Kant realizes that to realize the goodwill properly, there have to be some guidelines, some rules, some principles that have to be followed. We are going to have to base these rules on certain principles. He refers to these as maxims. These maxims are going to be the rules that we will use to figure out what is good in the goodwill. So let's look at life its own self, he says. We all do things for one reason or another. For example, in my classes, the students are taking a class in order to earn their degree. Why do they want a degree? Well, they're earning a degree in order to get a job. Why do they want a job? Well, they want to, own things. They want to have a house, car, boat, a couple of basset hounds, whatever. Now, notice in all of that, there is an in order to, or a for the sake of. These are not principles that are fulfilled in themselves. They fulfill some other requirement. So he calls these kinds of principles hypothetical. The hypothetical leads us to something else, to something else, and to something else. But that only takes us halfway. Remember, this goodwill has to be good in and of itself, and the principles that we work from must be good in and of themselves. So hypothetical principles are not sufficient. Now, there are two kinds of hypotheticals. There is the hypothetical of a skill. Again, like college students, they take classes in order to learn something, in order to get a job, in order to do whatever. Then there are imperatives of prudence, like making friends, being kind, cooperating with other people. But the hypothetical is not what Kant is after. Remember, he's looking for, some objective principles of morality. So we can't use hypotheticals because they're always on the way to something else. So what he's looking for is what he refers to as a categorical imperative. Categorical imperatives have to be absolute moral principles from which there are no exceptions. These have to be rational. There can be nothing subjective about it. There's no exceptions. There's no ifs or for the sake of or any of that. Further, he states, these categoricals must be imperative. That is, they are in the way of, have to be done. There can be no avoiding them. So the categorical imperative would be maxims, rules, or principles that have no exceptions and must be complied with. We have to figure out what the heck is a categorical imperative as a moral principle. Well, Kant gives us three versions of his categorical theory. Kant gives us three versions of his categorical imperative theory. You can think of them as filters, though, or qualifiers. For instance, the categorical imperatives must not be self-contradictory. Second, they must be universal, and absolute. Finally, they must not violate the principle of personal autonomy. So, let's look at each of these for a second. This idea of the self-contradictory has been discussed a lot in the literature. There are 5 basic interpretations of what he means by a categorical imperative must be non-contradictory. For our purposes, I think the best thing is to think of a categorical imperative that by its very creation would eliminate the need for that imperative. For instance, thievery, stealing from other people. Well, if we put that as a categorical imperative and said it's okay to steal, then that would mean that anybody, anywhere, at any time could steal as a absolute moral principle. Well, if anybody, everybody, absolutely stole whenever they wanted to, then there could be no such thing as private property. If there were no private property, then there would be no such thing as thievery. Stuff would just not have ownership. Our second qualifier, categorical imperatives must be universal and absolute. That is, the moral principle universally applies to everybody, everywhere, all the time. If it's good, it is good universally. If it's bad, it is bad universally, regardless of who you are, where you are, what circumstances, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're the President of the United States or, a galley slave. The categorical imperative must also be absolute. There can be no exceptions to them at all in any way. We have to say, do not lie. But if you add, do not lie except when, well, then you don't have an absolute principle. You've given a condition that lets you out of certain things. On the other hand, do not lie or be honest would be an absolute. Notice there's just do not lie, period. There's no comma, no exceptions, no exemptions. Something is either morally good or it's morally bad, period. And bear in mind, these categoricals, as we've said, if they are universal, then this should be part of our decision process in trying to figure out what a categorical imperative is. We must ask ourselves, what if this principle became an absolute moral law in a normative sense? That is, everybody has to obey this law all the time, everywhere, with no exceptions. And so at this point, what is a categorical imperative? This is a basic moral principle that must be rational, it must be absolute, and universal. Applies to everybody, everywhere, all the time. And under this idea, we would have to say, if slavery is bad today, here, now, then it has always been bad and always will be bad. On the other hand, if we were to say slavery is okay, then we would have to admit, absolute, universal, it is okay now, it was, and it always will be. However, slavery, Kant says, is not and cannot be a categorical imperative because it violates several of the provisions that he's already lined out. Second, it violates the third filter that we put on the categorical imperative, and that is this: a categorical imperative cannot violate the principle of personal autonomy. So what is this principle of personal autonomy? Now, the principle of personal autonomy is basically the idea that you, as an individual, and as he says it, any rational, cogent being has the absolute freedom to choose for themselves. Personal autonomy means You are free to have your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own beliefs, your own values, and you are free to choose yourself, for yourself, your future, your life. It's yours, you own it, you rule it. In saying this, Kant says, this means that no one has the right and should not have the authority to force their decisions on you. We are required to respect the autonomy of everybody else. You may have heard this from one of your teachers at some point who said, your rights end at the tips of your fingers, or your rights end at the point of somebody else's nose. Personal autonomy is for yourself and yourself only. Any time a decision that you make or an action that you make steps into someone else's life, then autonomy goes out of the question utterly. It becomes a question of their autonomy. You do not have the right to interfere with their lives, with their thoughts, with their feelings, with their values. Thus, for example, Kant would just be horrified by the idea of spousal abuse. This is just a horrible, awful thing to hurt someone else like that. An extension of this principle, in Kant's view, is in respecting personal autonomy, we cannot use other people as a means towards something else. Here's where Kant says that prostitution is evil. Why? Well, because it's two people, both of whom are using the other. The John is using the woman just as a convenience to relieve an itch he's got. The prostitute, on the other hand, is using the John just to make money. So he finds this is a really not a very nice thing to do. By the way, Kant never married. At any rate, we have to keep this in mind, the idea of personal autonomy, that you have the right to make your choices for yourself, and no one else can force their values, beliefs onto you, and you cannot force your values or beliefs on others. We have a discussion these days about, here in the United States at least, about putting God back in schools or putting prayer in the classroom. According to Kant, this is morally repugnant because it is an attempt by the state to force religious values or religious beliefs onto other people. That is not acceptable because it violates the principle of personal autonomy. Because, as Kant says, any rational being must be regarded as an end in themselves and not the means to an end. Keep in mind, he said at the very start, and he repeats several times through the metaphysics of morals, any rational, cogent being. He does not limit himself to humanity. This is going to be interesting for AI, for example. What if a machine reaches the point of independent, cogent reasoning? At that point, then Kant's theory would jump in. Kant would say, this is an autonomous being whose choices you must respect. And if somehow, at some point in the distant future, we meet for real life extraterrestrial beings that have their own spaceships and are flying around doing God knows what, those are rational, cogent beings, and we have to extend to them, according to Kant, the same principles that we apply to ourselves. Further of consequence here is, with the any rational, cogent being, there's nothing here about age or gender or anything else. If a child is a rational, cogent being who can think clearly, make choices, then that is a rational, cogent being, and we have to respect their personal autonomy. Can't just jump in and do whatever you want to with a child just because you feel like it. So, still on our way to figuring out how we're going to figure out what a categorical imperative is. First, imperatives have two forms. We mentioned this earlier. The two forms are the hypothetical imperatives. For the sake of X, do A. If you want to get a degree, you have to take courses. If you want to own a car, you have to pay for it. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, has no if, there's no for the sake of or in order to. It is a simple, flat statement. Categorical imperatives must be simple, flat statements. Simple is the key here. For example, I have on here, do A, be honest, be faithful, be charitable, be compassionate. Notice in each of these that it ends with a period. There's no comma. There's no because of. There's no for the sake of or in order to. And we can see this. Most religious moral codes are like that. They have simple, flat statements with a period at the end. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Yada, yada, yada. Be faithful. Be honest. Be charitable. Be thoughtful. Be humble. Those are categorical imperatives. Simple, flat statements, no commas, no exceptions. In general, let me say, many of my students have a problem at this point. They always want to sneak in some kind of condition on it. For example, in talking about the issue a few years back, there were people trying to immigrate across the U.S.-Mexican border. Border Patrol was seizing these people and seizing their children. They were taking the children away from their families and putting them in detention centers that looked just god-awful, terrible. Well, the students who think this is okay would always say, it's okay to take children when, or it was okay to take the children in order to teach the parents a lesson. And that's wrong in Kant's world. In Kant's idea, there is an absolute. Either it is okay to take someone's child from them, or it's not okay to take their child from them. And we can turn this by asking an earlier question. What if we made this an absolute universal principle? If we did that, then we'd have to say anybody can take any child at any time without exception. Somebody could just come into your house, take your children, and go off with them. That doesn't sound like a very good idea. So, have to keep in mind, these are simple, flat statements with no exemptions, no exceptions, no commas, there is no for the sake of or in order to. Simple statements. And so, before we set out to do something, anything, we have to examine what we are going to do and ask ourselves a few basic questions. The first one is, what is the basic moral principle that I am using? Take, for example, you're at a local shopping center or a mall, and you see a jewelry store sitting there. The sides are wide open, the cases are right there, there's boxes of expensive jewelry sitting on the counter. Now, you might, probably won't, but you might be seized with the idea, hey, I could snatch, grab, and run. We have to stop, Kant says, and ask ourselves, what is the basic moral principle here? Well, the basic moral principle here is thieving is okay. And by saying thieving is okay, I'm the thief from the jeweler, then it's, on the other hand, it would be okay for the jeweler to thieve from me. And then everybody would be thieves, and we just go on and on. So, anyway, then we can extend that principle, as we just did, try to make it a categorical imperative. What would the world be like if everybody followed this basic principle? In our example, if everybody could steal, there would be no personal property, and we'd all be just running around in the woods painting ourselves blue and worshiping trees or some such thing. Let's take another example. Lying. Well, here we have a real problem. If you're going to lie to somebody for whatever reason you might want to lie to someone, when you're lying, you are saying it is okay to lie. That means, by Kant, It is okay to lie anywhere, to anyone, for any reason, at any time. Now, what if we made that a moral categorical imperative? Then we would be saying it's okay. Totally, universally, and absolutely. If everybody followed that rule, everybody lied, then you wouldn't know, for example, if somebody was lying to you or if they were telling you the truth. And on the other hand, they couldn't tell if you are lying or telling the truth. If this were the case, then you couldn't trust anybody. And if there is no trust between anybody or among everybody, then there is no possibility of civil order or a civil society or civilization. Again, we'd be wind up running around in the woods, painting ourselves blue and having sex with trees or something. So lying does not work as a categorical imperative. On the other hand, what if we were to say, be honest? Could we make that a categorical imperative? Well, ask yourself, what would the world be like if everybody were honest with everybody, everywhere, all the time? Well, I'll tell you what, it would have made my careers much better if people hadn't been constantly lying to me about all sorts of things, about whether a contract had been let, if they had been honest about how much they were going to pay me, and on and on and on. It's really hard to trust people these days. Why? Because so many people lie so awful damn much about everything. On the other hand, if everybody were honest, then we could have established full trust and confidence in everybody, and we could have civil relations, civil society, and civilization. Having asked those questions, then we can determine whether what we're going to do is a categorical imperative or not by determining whether it would be okay with you if the world was full of liars or thieves or adulterers or whatever. Let's look at some further examples. These are just simple things that I use in class. Here's example 1. Suppose you ask for a loan. You give me $20 so I can go get a hamburger, knowing that you are not going to pay this person back. Well, then basically you're being a thief. You're saying it's okay to just take money from others. Well, if we try to make this a universal, an absolute moral imperative, then anybody could come to you and take money from you. Or you could take from others and people would just be... lending could not exist at all if there were no basis for this, if we could not trust the word of another person. Next, we have to ask ourselves, who will be affected by my action? If it's limited to myself and myself only, then there's no question at all. Sure, go ahead, knock yourself out. If you want to go home, sit on the couch, and work your way through a case of beer while watching, sports ball, fine, knock yourself out. That decision is affecting you and only you. On the other hand, if you decide that you're just going to go to the local Stop and Rob, get a case of beer, drink it while you're driving down the interstate, no, that's wrong. Why? Because it affects other people. Even just driving affects other people. This is why you should be circumspect with driving. What about the other people who are involved in the situation? If there are other people involved, then personal autonomy goes right out the window. Don't forget that. Now, if this action you're going to take involves other people, are you going to be using those other people as a means to an end? If you are going to be using other people as a means to get something else, then it's wrong. Now, let's back up here for a minute. This does not affect contractual situations. For example, I am not using my students to make money. My students are not using me to get a job. We have a contractual situation where we have contracted. I will do this for you. You will do this for me. We have mutually agreed to these, so we're not violating personal autonomy. And so the student-teacher relationship is morally permissible. As I mentioned earlier, my students often find ways to take these categorical imperative ideas and sneak in conditionals, trying to create a categorical imperative that lets them cling to their values or something that they want to do. I mentioned the stuff about immigrants at the southern border. It's the same thing. It's a violation of personal autonomy. From an examination of going through categorical imperatives or moral principles that might be categorical imperatives, you can sit down yourself and list whatever actions you think someone might take or you might take or whatever, and ask yourself whether these are good or not. And what Kant does is he steps through a few of these, and then he says, after looking at all of this and writing some of these down, what we end up with is a set of rules. And this points us towards those rules that are strictly binding on everyone with regard to everybody else. In short, they become duties. Kant insists that there are several duties. I've forgotten how many he lists in the Metaphysics, but just to give you an example, the primary duty, the first and most fundamental duty that you have is preservation of life. You are, Kant says, obligated to preserve your life. And indeed, there are, since time immemorial, ethicists and thinkers have said, yes, this is a fundamental rule. You have the right to defend yourself. If someone is going to attack you, if someone is trying to kill you, someone is trying to harm you, you have the right of self-preservation. You have the right of self-defense. But Kant also says you have a duty to preserve the lives of others. Oh, gosh. And I could go into politics here on several of the situations right now where basically people don't really give a damn about the lives of other peoples. We see all of the mass shootings here in the United States. We see the situation in Ukraine. There are similar situations throughout the world where people are not helping other people preserve their lives. We can extend this idea of the preservation of life of other reasoning, cogent beings, welfare, child support, WIC programs, helping people out of a bad situation into another, or beneficence or benevolence or charity. But it is a morally good thing, according to Kant, to help others, to preserve their lives. Another duty that we have is, and here we're going to do something odd here. We mentioned personal autonomy earlier. Kant says we must always act with respect to the law. Now, this often is misrepresented. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it and heard it. When Kant says we must always act with respect to the law, people think he's referring to written, prescriptive, normative laws, the civil law, criminal law, constitutional law, international law. That's not what he is talking about. When Kant says we must act with respect to the law, this is one particular law, and that is the principle of personal autonomy. It is a fundamental moral law according to Kant, and we must stick by it. Then finally, as an example, a basic duty is to be honest, and that means you should tell the truth as best you can. You should avoid, you might be able to hedge it, you can be tactful, you can be polite, but you must be honest. Being honest also is do not steal. It's also don't break promises. So those are some of the basic duties that Kant says that we have. And this will come back to us, and this is going to be very important when we get to our final little discussion about vaccines and required vaccinations, or as people say these days, mandatory vaccination. Now try applying this. Let's see how this works. We're going to see how this works by taking up the case of mandatory required vaccinations. Can we make this a categorical imperative? What is it morally permissible? Can we even say, yes, it is your moral duty to be vaccinated. Haha. Stay tuned, we're getting there.